They told me Ironville could not be saved. Not in those words. My counsel was careful with words. They had learned over the years that I did not forgive carelessness. But the meaning sat beneath everything they said in those final weeks of winter. The sacred wolves were dying, the bond between king and pack was fraying, and no healer in the inner realm had been able to stop it. 12 wolves in the inner yard. 10 now. The oldest ones going first, and then the younger, and the losses coming faster than the snow could cover the ground between the gate and the burial stone. I had ruled Ironville for 19 years. I had kept the inner wall standing through 2 border wars and 1 winter so cruel the river froze solid from bank to bank. I had not failed this kingdom. And I would not watch its sacred animals die in my own yard, while my counsel handed me apologies dressed up as explanations. My head healer was a careful man named Wynne. He had served under my father, and his silver-streaked hair gave him the look of a man who knew things. That winter, he knew nothing. I watched him stand at the door of the wolf yard on the 3rd day of the new moon and shake his head, and I felt something close, not panic, because I do not panic, but something that lived in the same house as it. "Tell me what you have not tried," I said. "My king," Wynne said, "I have tried everything within the wall." I looked at him. "Then we try something beyond the wall." The outer settlements of Ironville spread like a worn hem around the base of the mountain the fortress sat upon. They were not glamorous places. The pack registry listed them as provisioning settlements, woodcutters, river tenders, traders who moved goods between the northern holds and the lower valleys. The inner wall had stood between us and them for as long as either of us could remember, not out of cruelty, but out of structure. The inner hold was the heart of the kingdom. The outer settlements were its hands. Both were necessary, but we did not often open the gate between them except on trade days and the moon rites of high summer. My gate warden was a broad man named Cassin, who had held the inner gate for 11 years. He was loyal and efficient and had, I had come to understand, a particular talent for turning people away. He performed this service without malice, the way a stone wall performs the service of stopping the wind, not out of intention, but out of nature. What stood on the other side of Cassin's gate stayed on the other side, and he slept well for it. I told Wynne to send word to the outer settlements that any healer or wolf tender with knowledge of the sacred wolves' condition should come forward. I told him quietly, privately, between us alone, because I did not want my counsel discussing who was and was not worthy to approach the inner wall. The wolves were dying. Worthiness could wait. He sent word on the 4th morning. She arrived on the 5th. I did not see her arrival. I was in the high chamber above the inner yard, watching Aldrin from the window, or trying to watch him. Aldrin was the oldest of the inner wolves, a great silver-gray animal whose age no one quite agreed on. My father had named him long before I was born, which put him somewhere past 40 years, which no wolf of his kind should have been able to reach. He had outlived every other wolf of his generation by decades, and the pack council called him sacred the way they called very old things sacred, with a reverence that was also, underneath, a little fear. He had taken to lying in the far corner of the yard against the cold stone wall, and he had not eaten in 6 days. So I was watching Aldrin when Cassin appeared at my door. "A woman from Dunefin has come to the gate," he said. "She says she tends wolves." Dunefin was the furthest of the outer settlements, a river valley settlement at the western edge of the Ironville Range, barely on the official registry. I had been there once years ago, riding the border inspection. I remembered gray stone houses set close to the river and smoke from low chimneys and wolves moving through the settlement openly as if they belonged to it. They had no inner yard, no formal pack structure. They were, in the council's understanding, unregistered wolf keepers. Which meant they were, in the council's understanding, not quite the thing. "Send her up," I said. Cassin paused. It was the kind of pause that said many things without saying any of them. "My king," he said, "she is from Dunefin." "She is not." I know where Dunafin is, Cassin. Of course. Another pause. There is a protocol when outer settlement residents approach the inner. The wolves are dying, I said. He stopped. Send her to the outer yard, I said. The eastern section. Tell her the 3 wolves in the outer pens have not been touched by any healer yet. Tell her they are in the worst condition. I paused. Tell her if she can tend them, she may come to the inner gate and speak with Wynne. It was a test, and I knew it, and I was not entirely proud of it. The outer yard's eastern section was where we kept the wolves who had already been deemed beyond the reach of my inner healers, the 3 animals who had stopped eating longest, whose coats had gone dull, who did not raise their heads when I walked past. Wynne had stopped entering their pens 4 days ago. He had not said so directly, but I had seen him stop. If this woman from Dunafin could do anything for those 3 animals, she could do anything, and she could come to the inner gate with her head held as high as she liked. If she could not, well, the outer yard's eastern section had its own gate, and Cassin would close it, and that would be the end of it. It was not, as I say, a proud test, but I was a man running out of wolves, and I had no room for sentiment. I went back to watching Aldrin. An hour passed. He did not move. I could see the faint rise and fall of his flanks, slow and labored, and the frost of his breath in the cold air. His great silver head was down against the stone, and I had the particular feeling a man gets when something he loves is quietly slipping beyond his reach, and he cannot find the rope to pull it back. I was born to this kingdom, not to that yard, and I had spent enough years governing from above that I was not always comfortable with what I could not control from a distance. I knew how to command. I was less practiced at the kind of helplessness that comes when command is not the tool the situation requires. I left the window. I went down to the inner yard, crossed the frost-hardened ground to the gate that divided the inner from the outer, and stood at it long enough that the guard stationed there began to look uncertain. I did not tell him what I was doing. I was not entirely sure myself. Through the bars of the gate I could see across the outer yard to the eastern pens. The distance was not great, perhaps 40 paces. The pens themselves were low stone enclosures with iron-grilled doorways, and the woman from Dunafin was inside the first of them. She had not noticed me. She was entirely focused on the wolf. I watched her. She was not what I had pictured when Cassin said the word Dunafin. I had pictured a rough-handed, older woman in the way that practical people from the outer settlements often were, capable and unsentimental, the kind of person who knew animals the way a carpenter knows wood. This woman was not old, though she was not young in the way my counsel's daughters were young, kept smooth and purposeless by comfortable living. She had the look of someone who had spent years outdoors and did not mind it. Her dark hair was braided back simply. Her coat was good wool, well worn, mended at one sleeve. She had set her pack down outside the pen and was kneeling beside the wolf without any ceremony at all, as though kneeling in a cold stone pen beside a dying animal was a perfectly ordinary thing to do. The wolf, I knew this one, a younger male we had named Breck for his tendency, in better days, to race the river current, had his head on the ground and was breathing in the labored, flat way that had become familiar to me over the past 3 weeks. He did not lift his head when she entered. He did not do much of anything. She put her hand on his neck. I felt through the bars of the gate, some 40 paces away, a silence that had nothing to do with the cold. Breck exhaled. Long, slow, the breath coming out of him in a thin fog. His ears moved. Not lifted, just moved, the faintest adjustment, as if something had changed in the air around him and he was recalibrating. She kept her hand on him and began to speak. I could not hear her from where I stood. The distance and the cold and the sound of the wind in the outer wall's stone battlements above us swallowed whatever she was saying. I watched her lips move, and I watched Breck's ears settle into something that, in a werewolf, I would have called ease. She reached into her pack with her free hand without removing the other from his neck. She brought out a small cloth bundle and unwrapped it, some preparation of herbs and something else, something dark and densely packed, and held it near his nose without forcing it. She waited. He turned his nose toward it himself. I stayed at the gate. She moved to the second pen without hurrying, the way experienced people move when they know the work is long and rushing will not shorten it. The wolf in the second pen was a female we called Dara, and Dara had not been on her feet in 2 days. The woman from Dunefin looked at her for a long moment before going in, studying her the way a healer studies a map before entering unfamiliar ground. Then she went in, and she knelt, and she put her hand on Dara the same way she had put her hand on Breck. I stood at that gate for a long time. My guard, to his credit, said nothing. The evening light had shifted to the amber of late afternoon by the time she came out of the third pen. She gathered her pack with the methodical care of someone who knows where everything goes and why, retied the cloth bundle, slung it over her shoulder, and then looked up directly at the inner gate, directly at me. She did not flinch. She did not bow hurriedly, the way outer settlement residents sometimes did when they realized they had been watched by the king. She looked at me the way one person looks at another from across a yard, with a clear and even gaze, and then she walked toward the gate. "They need warmth more than medicine tonight," she said, when she was close enough that I could hear her properly. Her voice was even and unhurried. "Someone has been packing cold herbs against their bellies. Cold extracts the heat. Whatever is wrong with them, and it is not a sickness, I should tell you that, they have been losing warmth faster than they can generate it. They need heated stones, dried grass for bedding, and the barkand root preparation I have left for each of them. That and rest will do more tonight than any additional treatment." I looked at her. "Not a sickness," I said. "No," she did not look away. "They are cold weakened. Something in the inner yard is drawing the warmth out of them, and the cold preparations your healers have been using, however well-intentioned, have been compounding it. Wind's preparations are excellent for fever. These wolves do not have fever." I stared at her. Wynn had been treating them for fever. I had not known that. I had not asked. The particular helplessness I described earlier settled back onto my shoulders with the comfortable weight of a thing that had been waiting there. "Your name," I said. "Myra," she said, "from Dunefin." "Myra from Dunefin," I said. "How long have you tended wolves?" "Since I was 8, she said. "My mother tended them before me. The outer settlement's wolves are not formally registered, so we have no titles for what we do. We simply do it." I looked at her. The word she had used, simply, did something to the space between us that I could not entirely account for. There was no apology in it, no defiance. It was the word a person uses when a thing is true and they know it and they do not require permission to know it. "Come inside," I said. It was Casson who cleared his throat behind me. He had appeared without my noticing, the way Casson had a talent for appearing when he felt his gait was being insufficiently managed. "My king," he said, with the careful tone of a man choosing each word the way a person chooses footing on uncertain ground. "The inner yard protocols regarding outer settlement." "Casson," I said. He stopped. "Open the gate." He did. His expression did not change, but his hands on the iron latch were, I noticed, somewhat more deliberate than the task required. Myra of Dunefin walked through the inner gate of Ironville with her worn pack over one shoulder, and her dark hair braided back against the cold, and she did not look left or right at the inner yard, or the stone towers, or the flagged courtyard that had taken my grandfather's stonemasons 11 years to lay. She looked at the wolves. She found the first wolf along the northern wall, a young female who had not eaten in 4 days, who had been one of Wynn's charges and who had not improved in a week, and stopped. "May I?" she said. She was asking me. My wolf yard, my protocol, I nodded. She went to the wolf and crouched beside it, and I watched the same thing happen that had happened in the outer pens. The animal, who had not responded to any healer in a week, turned its nose slightly toward her hand. Wynne appeared from the inner yard door at the far end, saw her, and then looked at me with an expression that fell somewhere between surprise and relief and professional affront. "She is here at my invitation," I said. He came across the yard. He and Myra spoke for a long time, longer than I expected. I had anticipated either deference on her part or dismissal on his, and got neither. They spoke the way two people speak when they are both fluent in the same difficult language and are discovering with something like relief that there is someone else who knows it. They disagreed twice. I could tell by the particular energy of disagreement, the slight stiffening, the restatement, and each time they came back to an understanding that left both of them satisfied. I stood in the cold and watched this, and felt something I would not have named at the time. The wolves were moved to new bedding before nightfall. The cold preparations were replaced. Myra stayed. I had not told her to stay. I had not told her she could stay. She simply remained, methodically working from wolf to wolf as the evening deepened, and no one, not Casson, not Wynne, not the 2-yard keepers who regarded her with the particular suspicion reserved for outsiders who appear too capable, told her to leave. At some point, I told them not to. I want to be precise about what happened over the next 3 days, because it matters, and because I have a tendency to oversimplify things I do not entirely understand. I should tell you first about the council, because they were also happening during those 3 days, in the way that councils happen, continuously, in rooms adjacent to the rooms where the actual important work is being done. My senior advisor, a man named Toval who had been advising the Ironville kingship since before I was born, and wore this fact the way some men wear a medal, sought me out on the morning after Myra arrived to express what he called his qualified concern. Toval's qualified concerns were generally just concerns with an extra layer of careful language applied, the way you apply mortar to a wall you are uncertain will hold. "The woman from Dunefin," he said, when he had found me in the corridor outside the yard. "Casson tells me she has been given access to the inner keep's drying room." "She has," I said. "She is from Dunefin," he said. "I am aware of where she is from." "She has no formal standing," he said. "No pack registry entry, no." "Toval," I said, "how many wolves were in the inner yard this morning?" He paused. "9, he said. "How many this time last week?" 12, he said, after a slightly longer pause. "How many did I have this morning that 8? He stopped. He was a precise man, and he did not like saying things he could not support, and what he could support from the yard-keeper's morning report was this: 4 wolves had eaten that morning, including 2 who had not eaten in a week. He said it without additional commentary, which was, from Toval, its own form of concession. "I am going to trust her for 3 days, I said. "If I am wrong, you may remind me of this conversation at length." He did not remind me of it. He had his own form of grace, Toval did, which expressed itself primarily as silence at moments when he had been persuasively incorrect. What happened over the 3 days was this: the wolves ate. Not all of them at once, not dramatically. Breck in the outer eastern pen was the first. He stood on the second morning and pressed his nose to the iron grill of his pen door, which was his signal, in better times, that he wanted out. The yard-keeper reported this to me as if it were a minor miracle, and I supposed it was. Dara followed a day later. The young female along the northern inner wall, we had named her Sable for her coat's deep color, ate on the 3rd night, while the snow began again, and the torches in the yard threw warm circles against the dark. The 3 worst cases in the inner yard, the animals Wynne had quietly stopped entering the pens of, were slower. But they were slower in the direction of recovery, which was a different kind of slow than the direction they had been going before she arrived. Myra worked without drama. This was what I noticed most. She was not performing a healing for an audience. She was simply doing what she knew, methodically and without requiring acknowledgement. She asked for what she needed: a specific clay vessel, river clay if possible, not the fired kind, a bundle of dried wintergrass from the settlement stores, access to the inner keep's drying room for 12 hours. She asked when, and she asked the yard keepers, and she asked, once, me, for the clay vessel, which was an unusual request, and which required my specific authorization to pull from the storage deep in the keep's lower rooms. I had gone to find it myself. The lower rooms were not a place my staff expected me to be, and I encountered 3 very surprised servants in the process of locating it. But I found the clay vessel, and I brought it to the yard, and I handed it to her. She looked at it, then at me, with an expression that was careful and direct. "Thank you," she said. 2 words not performed, not careful, just true. I went back to managing the kingdom. I had been neglecting the daily reviews for 3 days, and my council was gentle with their urgency in the way that my council had learned to be, which meant they were, in fact, urgently behind on a great many things, and were hoping I would not notice how many. I noticed. I worked through the evening reviews and the border dispatches, and a dispute between 2 outer western settlements over a shared waterway, and I sat through a lengthy report from Toval about the provisioning agreements for the spring trade season, and I made 14 decisions that needed to be made and postponed 2 that did not yet need to be made. And at some point during all of this, I realized I had been sitting with one hand resting on the table in a particular way. Not the way I usually rested my hand on the table, which was flat and deliberate, a king's hand ready for the next document. I was resting it the way I had rested it against Aldrin's pen door that afternoon, feeling the iron of it, as if looking for warmth through a surface. I moved my hand. I picked up the next document. I was a king and I was busy. But the deep current, and I knew what it was now, or I was beginning to know. I had been raised on the pack bond lore, and I was not an unintelligent man. The deep current does not care about documents or evening reviews. It moves the way the river moves under the ice in winter, quietly, continuously, entirely indifferent to what is happening on the surface above it. At some point in the deep evening, past the 3rd watch, I found myself standing again at the inner yard window. The yard was quiet. The night torches were down to their last oil. The snow that had started in the evening had stopped, and the yard was white and still and very cold. And in the far corner, where Aldrin lay against the stone wall, there was a figure crouched beside him. I was down the stairs before I had made a conscious decision to be. The inner yard was cold enough that my breath came in clouds, and the snow creaked under my boots with the particular sound that very cold, very still nights produce, and Myra did not hear me coming until I was perhaps 10 paces away. She turned, saw me, and did not startle. She put one finger to her lips, the way a person signals quiet in a room with a sleeping child, and then turned back to Aldrin. I came to stand beside her and looked down. Aldrin's head was not on the stone. He had lifted it not high, not with anything approaching the authority he had carried in better years, but it was raised, and his great silver eyes were open, and they were looking at Myra. She had her hand against the side of his face, not forcing it there, not holding it with any pressure, resting it the way you rest a hand against something you are afraid to disturb. The soft light of the single remaining torch picked out the silver gray of his coat and the dark brown of her hand and made them both look, in the way that winter nights in stone yards sometimes make things look ancient and inevitable. I did not speak. She did not speak. Aldrin breathed, long and slow, and I felt the sound of it somewhere behind my ribs in a place I had not expected to feel anything. I had not been this close to her before. The 3 days had been a series of distances across the outer yard, across the inner yard, across the length of the keep's lower rooms. Now she was beside me, close enough that I could see the color of her hair in the torchlight. It was not simply dark, as I had thought. There were threads of deep amber in it that the outdoor cold and the torchlight found and lit. And I was aware, in the way that the body is sometimes aware of things before the mind has named them, of a warmth that had nothing to do with the torch. I looked at Aldrin. The thing I have already said about Aldrin. He was old and he was sacred, and he had been going slowly away for 6 days. He had not eaten. He had not lifted his head. Wynne had not said in so many words that he expected Aldrin to die, but he had said enough around those words that their meaning was clear. Aldrin looked at Myra. He did not look at me. In 30 years of my being in this yard, first as a child brought by my father, then as a young king standing beside a father who was teaching him to stand, Aldrin had always looked at me the way the sacred wolves look at the king, with a clear and ancient recognition, the wolf and alpha acknowledgement that is the foundation of everything Ironville's bond is built on. He was not looking at me now. He was looking at her. I felt it then, not with my hands or my eyes. With the thing that every alpha in every bond line has felt at least once, if he is honest about it. The thing that the pack council calls the deep current, the cord between king and destined mate that runs below the surface of ordinary feeling, that does not announce itself but simply is, the way the river is, the way the stone beneath the snow is. There and permanent, whether you are looking at it or not. It ran between me and Myra of Dunnifen at roughly the 3rd hour past midnight, in my snow-cold inner yard, beside an old wolf who had stopped eating 6 days ago and had now lifted his head for the first time. I would like to tell you, I handled it with great composure. I took a slow breath. I stood very still. I looked at Aldrin and not at her, because looking at her in that moment felt like the kind of thing that needed to be done carefully or not at all. She was still looking at Aldrin. She had not moved. She was not aware, or did not appear to be aware, of what had just happened in the space between us. "How long has he been like this?" I asked. My voice was quieter than I intended it to be. The yard, the night, the particular stillness of snow demanded it. "He turned toward me about an hour ago," she said in the same quiet register. "He has not eaten, but he allowed me to rest my hand there, and he has not turned away. That is good, I think. In my experience, that is very good." A pause. "He is very old." "Yes," I said. "Older than I have seen before in any wolf." She looked at Aldrin with the clear, unhurried attention she gave everything. "He is not dying of what the others have. He is simply tired, in the way that very old things are tired. He is looking for a reason to stay." I felt those words the way you feel a stone dropped into still water, the impact, and then the rings moving outward until they reach the edge of everything. "And has he found one?" I asked. I had not planned to ask that. The question came from somewhere less governed than the place I usually spoke from. She turned to look at me. For the first time that evening we were looking at each other directly, and the torchlight was between us, and her expression was open and a little careful, not afraid, but attending, the way she attended the wolves. "I think so," she said. Aldrin exhaled. It was a long sound, slow and settling, and it was not the labored sound of an animal struggling. It was the sound of an animal choosing, deliberately, in the way that very old animals sometimes do, to stay a little longer. He laid his head in her lap. "I have carried a great many things in 19 years of kingship. The weight of 2 wars, the weight of a council that does not always agree with me and is not always wrong not to, the weight of every border dispute and every hard winter and every choice that had to be made with no good options. I carried all of that, and I knew its weight, and I had learned to carry it without letting the carrying show. What I felt watching Aldrin lay his head in Myra's lap was not like any of those things. It was older. It was, in some way I did not fully understand, not mine alone. It belonged to the bond line, to Ironville's history, to whatever the sacred wolves had known since before my grandfather's stonemasons laid the first flagstone in this yard. It was the feeling of something arriving that had been on its way for a very long time. I sat down on the cold ground beside her. She looked at me. "You'll freeze," she said quietly. "Ironville kings are less delicate than that," I said. Something in her expression shifted, not a smile, but the precondition of one. She turned back to Aldrin. We sat beside him until the fourth watch. Neither of us said a great deal. She kept her hand on him, and I sat close enough to feel the warmth of her presence against the winter cold, and Aldrin slept actual sleep, not the labored half-wakefulness he had been trapped in with his great silver head in her lap. When the night guard changed and the new torches were lit, she looked at the fresh light and then at Aldrin, who had shifted in his sleep but was breathing easily, and she carefully, slowly, lifted her hand and rose without waking him. She found her feet without difficulty. I admit, slightly slower. Cold ground after several hours is a humbling thing for any man's joints, regardless of his station. She did not comment on this. She looked at Aldrin once more and then looked at me. "He will sleep until morning," she said. "He will eat tomorrow, I believe. Not much, but something." "You believe," I said. "I do not promise what I cannot keep," she said. "But I have sat beside a good many wolves, and that is what I believe." I looked at her. The warmth of the new torches had reached us, and I could see her clearly now, the directness of her, the quality of steadiness she carried that was not performing anything, that simply existed in her the way the river exists in its course, without effort. "Myra of Dunefin," I said, "you came here because Wynn's word reached the outer settlements." "Yes," she said. "And you expected to be turned away at the gate." A pause. "Cassin's gate," she said, with the careful neutrality of a person who is being accurate rather than unkind, "does not generally open for outer settlement residents unless it is a trade day." "And you came anyway." She looked at me. "They were dying," she said simply. The same word she had used the first day, in the same tone, as if the explanation were complete in itself, as if the question of whether the gate would open had been entirely beside the point. That was when I understood, fully and without the possibility of further argument with myself, what the deep current had been telling me since the third hour past midnight. She was my mate. Not because the old wolf had chosen her, though he had. Not because she had healed my wolves when no one else could, though she had. Because of the word she had just used for the second time, simply, and the way she used it, as if the right thing to do was obvious and she required no permission to do it, and the idea that a gate might be closed between her and a living creature that needed her had been, to her, not a barrier but merely a delay. I had been looking for that quality, without knowing I was looking for it, for 19 years. I did not say any of this to her. I am not, by nature, a man who announces internal landscapes before he is certain of the ground. I said good night, and I told her Wynn would have a chamber prepared for her inside the keep, which produced a particular expression on her face that suggested she had been planning to sleep in the outer yard storage shed, and had genuinely not considered an alternative. And then I went back inside and stood in the corridor outside the great hall for a long moment with my hand against the cold stone of the wall. The stone of Ironville's inner keep has a particular quality in very cold weather. It holds the cold, yes, but it also holds something else, a residual warmth from the fires that have burned against it for 3 generations, a buried memory of heat that surfaces in certain lights, in certain silences. My father used to say that the stone knew the history of the house. I had thought it was something he said because he had grown up without it and valued it the way people value things they chose rather than inherited. Standing there in the corridor, I thought he might simply have been right. Aldrin ate the next morning. Not much, half of what Myra brought him, a soft preparation she made in the clay vessel before the yard was fully light. But he ate, and he kept what he ate, and by midday he had stood for the first time in 6 days. I did not make a ceremony of it. I went to the yard when the yard keeper's report reached me, and I stood at a distance, and I watched Aldrin stand. He was not steady. He shifted his weight like a man learning to walk after a long illness, his great legs finding the ground again with careful deliberation. Myra stood a few paces from him. She was not touching him. She was simply there, close enough to matter, far enough to let him manage the standing himself. He stood. He turned toward her. He walked 3 deliberate steps in her direction and leaned his shoulder against her side, the way the sacred wolves lean against the alpha when they are acknowledging the bond. He had not done that for any person except me in the 6 years since my father died. The yard keeper behind me made a small sound that he suppressed too late. I let the moment be what it was, then I crossed the yard. Myra looked up. Aldrin did not move away. He stayed where he was, his shoulder against her side, watching me approach with his ancient silver eyes. "He is standing," I said. "Yes," she said. "You said you do not promise what you cannot keep," I said. I also said I believed he would eat. The precondition of a smile again, she was careful with them, kept them at some distance from full expression, the way someone is careful with anything valuable. I have been known to be right occasionally. I looked at her. "Come to the inner hall tonight," I said. "Wynne and I have a question for you." The question at its plainest was this: would she stay? I did not ask it plainly. I am a king, and I have a council, and there is a form to things. Wynne presented the formal arrangement, a position as inner-keep wolf keeper, with a chamber in the east wing and access to the inner yard and all associated stores and provisions. He said it with his best official manner, which was considerable, and he made it sound both reasonable and dignified, which it was. Cassin was in the room. He had positioned himself near the wall in the way that people position themselves near walls when they feel the room is heading in a direction they are uncertain about but are too professional to visibly resist. His expression was the expression of a man keeping a gate in his mind. Myra listened to Wynne's offer and looked at me once, briefly. Not for permission, I understood, but as a person looks at the one who is actually making the decision, to see whether the decision is honestly made. Whatever she saw, she was satisfied with. "I would need," she said to Wynne, "to go back to Dunafin first. There are 3 wolves in my settlement who are in the early stage of what your wolves had. I want to treat them before I am too far away to do it properly." Wynne blinked. "You have wolves in Dunafin with this condition." "Since 2 weeks before yours," she said. "It is moving from the outer settlements in. Whatever is cooling the ground, it started in the western range and it is moving east. If you want to stop it reaching the inner yard again, someone will need to work from the outside in." There was a silence in which Cassin made a small sound and Wynne rubbed the back of his neck, and I looked at the ceiling of the inner hall, which had been painted 4 generations ago with the wolf bond insignia, and had never been repainted because no one could agree on whether to do it in the old style or the new. "How long will it take in Dunafin?" I said. 3 days, she said. 4 if one of them is worse than I expect. "And then you will come back." She looked at me. "If the position is still available," she said, "I would not assume it would be held." "It will be held," I said. Cassin made the same small sound again. She went to Dunafin. I did not go with her. A king does not typically ride 3 days through the western range to accompany an outer settlement wolf keeper on a routine treatment visit. And if I had, my council would have had a great deal to say about it, and not very quietly. I sent 2 of my border riders with her, on the grounds that the western range had seen some disruption from a border dispute over the waterway, and the roads were not entirely safe. This was a true reason and also, I will admit, not the entire reason. She was gone 4 days. The wolf in the worst condition in Dunafin had been worse than she expected. She sent word with my border rider on the 3rd day, a brief note in a clean, unhurried hand. 1 more day. She was right. She was back on the 4th. I had told myself in the 4 days of her absence that I would approach the question of the mate bond with appropriate deliberation. I had told myself this because I had been wrong before, not about a mate bond, but about the instinct to move quickly toward things I wanted, and the wisdom of caution. I had learned caution the way most men learn it, which is to say badly, and only after its absence had cost me something. The 4 days were, in their way, instructive. The inner yard was quieter without her in it, not emptier in a physical sense. The wolves, the yard keepers, Wynn's daily visits, all of that continued, but there was a quality of attention missing. I walked through the yard on the second morning and understood, standing beside Breck's pen, that what was missing was a particular kind of looking. She looked at the wolves the way the wolves themselves looked at the land around them, fully, without hierarchy, as if every detail were equally worth attending to. When I stood in the yard without her, I noticed that I looked at it differently, as a king looks at what belongs to him, which is a real form of care but not the same form. Aldrin noticed. He was eating and standing, and had returned to his usual place in the center yard on warm afternoons. But on the 3rd day he went back to the corner against the cold stone wall, and he lay down with his head on his forepaws, and he stayed there until the 4th morning, when she came through the gate. The pack bond's lore says, among other things, that the sacred wolves feel the bond line's pulls before the humans do. I had thought, in my youth, that this was the kind of thing the old texts say, because old texts like to say something meaningful. Standing in the yard on the 3rd evening, watching Aldrin's ears track toward the western gate as if listening for something not yet in earshot, I thought it might simply be true. I went back inside. I had a kingdom to run. I ran it. But I ran it with the same quality of waiting that Aldrin had, that low-level, constant orientation toward something not yet arrived, which is, in its way, one of the oldest feelings there is. When I heard the border rider's return and went to the inner courtyard gate, and she came through it with her pack over one shoulder and her braid loosened by 4 days of riding, and her coat carrying the smell of road dust and pine resin and cold river air, and she looked at me with that clear, even gaze and said, simply, "Aldrin." I understood that appropriate deliberation was going to be a shorter process than I had allocated for it. "Standing," I said, "eating, waiting for you, I think." She smiled, fully this time not the precondition of one. It changed her face the way light changes a room, not by making it something different, but by revealing what had always been in it. She went to the inner yard. I followed. Aldrin was in the center of the yard when she entered, which was itself remarkable. He had not been to the center of the yard in 3 weeks. He was not running. He did not run any more at his age. But he was standing in the morning light with his great silver head raised and his ears forward, and when she came through the gate he walked toward her at the deliberate, careful pace of a very old animal who has decided that the occasion warrants the effort. She went down on one knee. He put his forehead against hers. The inner yard was not empty. Wynn was there, and the 2 morning yard keepers, and Casson, who had apparently developed a habit of being present in any room where something important was happening. They all saw it. What happened next did not happen because I planned it. I want to be accurate about this. I had intended, and this is the truth, to approach the question of the bond in stages, to speak with Myra privately first, to give her all the information and all the choice, to let the process be as deliberate as I had promised myself it would be. What happened instead was that Aldrin lifted his head from her forehead and turned and looked at me. It was the look he had given me in my childhood when I had done something right, a steady, ancient, fully certain gaze, the look of an animal who has always known something and is, at last, informing you of it. I crossed the yard. Myra rose as I came. Her expression shifted not to alarm, but to the careful attention she gave things she was not certain about. She was uncertain about me, I realized. Not afraid. She was not a woman who moved in fear of things the way some people do, but uncertain, in the honest way of a person who does not know what a powerful man is about to do in his own yard and is watching carefully. I stopped in front of her. "Myra," I said, "I need to tell you something." She waited. There was a quality to the way she waited that I had come to recognize, steady and open, without anticipation in either direction. She did not lean toward or away from what was coming. She simply made room for it. "The sacred wolves of Ironville bond to the Alpha and to the Alpha's mate," I said. "It is not a ceremony. It is not a protocol. It is the old bond line, the one this kingdom has kept since before the wall was built. Aldrin has never given his bond to anyone outside that line." She was very still. "What he did this morning," I said, "is not something a wolf in his line does for a healer. It is something a wolf in his line does for the person the bond recognizes." A long pause. The yard was entirely silent. Behind her, Aldrin stood with his great head still raised, watching both of us. "I see," she said. Her voice was level, not frightened. Processing, I thought, turning it over, looking at all its surfaces. "I am not telling you this as a command," I said, "or as an arrangement. I am telling you because you came through a gate that has very rarely been opened for you, and tended wolves that no one expected you to be able to tend, and you did all of it without asking for anything in return. You deserve to know what the bond line means and what it is offering." I held her gaze. "And you deserve to choose." She looked at me for a long time. I let her. There was nothing in the yard except the morning light and the old wolf's breathing and the particular quality of the space between us, which had stopped being ordinary air some days ago. "When you say choose," she said slowly, "you mean?" "I mean you can say no," I said. "You can stay as the inner keeps wolf keeper. You can tend these wolves, and Wynn will drive you mad with his preparations, and Casson will be suspicious of you for approximately 6 more months before he decides he respects you, which he will." A pause. "Or you can tell me that what you feel in this yard is what I feel in this yard, and we can speak about what that means." Something moved behind her eyes. I could not name it precisely. I am better at running a kingdom than at reading the internal weather of another person's expression. But it was not distance. It was not refusal. "I feel something in this yard," she said very quietly, "that I have not felt anywhere before." "Yes," I said. I am from Dunefin," she said. "I am not from any pack registry. I have no standing in the inner." "I am the standing," I said. "In Ironville I am the standing, and I am telling you it is yours." She looked at Aldrin. The old wolf was watching her with the patience of a creature who has already waited a great many years for something, and is willing to wait a little longer. Then she looked back at me. "All right," she said. It was not the declaration of a great romance in the way that stories sometimes require. No quoted claim before a gathered court. No ceremony stopped mid-rite. No dramatic reversal. It was 2 words spoken quietly in a cold yard by a woman who chose things the same way she did everything. Directly, without performance, without requiring permission. All right. The same quality as simply as the same steady, unembellished truth. All right was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to me. I reached out and took her hand. The mate mark came then, and I will tell you about it as it was, not as I expected it to be. I had grown up with the pack bond's lore. I knew the formal descriptions of the marking, the gold flame language of the ceremony, the way the pack bond texts describe the mate mark blazing up the wrist and the arm. That is not what happened, or it is not only what happened. What happened was warmth, real warmth, the kind that lives in fired clay and old stone, and the heat that has been kept for years in a thing that does not easily give up what it holds. It came up through both our hands, and I felt it travel to my chest and stay there, and Myra looked down at our joined hands with an expression I have not forgotten, open and a little awed, not at the power of it, but at the quality of it, the way a person is awed by warmth when they have been cold for a long time. On her wrist the mark appeared. On mine, a mirror of it, The wolf of Ironville's bond line, traced in the deep amber gold of the old fire, not blazing but steady, permanent, the way things are that have always been going to be. Aldrin made a sound, low and resonant, the sound that the old texts call the bond cry, and which the oldest yard keepers will tell you they have only heard once or twice in a lifetime. It moved through the inner yard and up the stone walls and into the morning air, and I felt it not just with my ears but with the place behind the ribs where I had felt the deep current 3 nights ago. Wynne, behind us, sat down on the low stone bench near the north wall. He did not appear to have done this intentionally. It seemed simply to have happened, the way sitting down happens when the legs have reached a decision before the mind. Casson, for the first time in 11 years as my gate warden, said nothing. The wolves in the yard, all of them, the recovered and the recovering and the ones still finding their strength, turned toward us. They did not bow, because wolves do not bow in the way that storytellers sometimes like to say wolves bow. They did what wolves do. They stood, and they oriented, and they looked. All of them, including Aldrin, who had turned from beside her to face us both, and was standing in the morning light with his great silver head raised. Looking, acknowledging. The way the sacred wolves have acknowledged the Alpha, and the Alpha's mate in this kingdom, since before the wall was built. I did not let go of her hand. "You'll need a proper room," I said, after a moment that had been long enough to contain a great many things. "The East Wing chamber when arranged is good, but there is a better one at the end of the corridor, with a window over the inner yard." She looked at me, the precondition of a smile, and then the smile itself, fully given this time, and I was not prepared for it, not entirely, which I will admit was a humbling experience for a man who generally likes to feel that he is prepared for things. "I will need to go back to Dunefin regularly," she said. "The outer wolves will be seen to," I said. "We will open the gate for their keepers. It should have been open before." She looked at me for a moment with something in her expression that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction, but lived in the space between them. "Casson will argue about that," she said. "Casson argues about most things and ultimately does them," I said. "He is very efficient." Behind us, I heard Casson make a sound that was, if I am being accurate, somewhat strangled. We stayed in the yard for a long time after that. There was no ceremony that morning, no formal witnessing, no proclamation before the pack. Those things would come, my counsel would require them, and I was not opposed to them, and in due time Ironville's hall would be lit, and the bond would be witnessed, and the wolf cry would be sounded, and the pack would know. Those things are important. They would happen. But the real moment had already happened. It had happened in a cold stone yard at the 3rd hour past midnight 3 nights before, a deep current running between 2 people who were, at that moment, simply sitting on frozen ground beside a very old wolf who had decided to stay. I had not known then, or not entirely, but the bond line had known. Aldrin had known. The warmth in the old stone had known. I have ruled Ironville for 19 years. I have made decisions that cost things I did not want to lose and kept things I was glad of, and learned, at some expense, the difference between governing by command and governing by understanding. Of all the things I have held responsibility for, the wolves are the thing I was least prepared to lose. They are not simply animals, though they are that. They are the oldest agreement in Ironville's history, the covenant between the land and the pack line that says, if you honor what lives here will sustain you in return. I had spent 19 years trying to be worthy of that agreement. The winter they began to die, I was not certain I was. She gave them back to me. Not through power, not through ceremony, not through anything that can be formally registered or logged in the pack registry, though the pack registry was subsequently updated at length. Wynne saw to that with the thoroughness of a man who has been waiting for something to file for quite some time. She gave them back through the quality she carried in both hands, and at the center of her steady, unhurried, simply nature. The knowledge that a living thing that needed care was reason enough to go through any gate. Aldrin lived for 4 more years. He ate regularly from the day Myra arrived, and in the spring he could be found on warm afternoons, lying in the center of the inner yard, not against the cold stone wall but in the sun, with his great silver head in her lap, sleeping. The yard keepers had long since stopped remarking on it. It was simply what Aldrin did, and Myra's lap was simply where he slept, and the deep contentment of that arrangement was, for those 4 years, one of the most reliable things in Ironville. The outer settlement gate was opened on a permanent schedule 6 weeks after Myra walked through it the first time. Casson managed the new protocol with the efficiency of a man who has decided that if a thing is going to be done, it will be done correctly, and he was not wrong about that. And the waterway dispute in the outer west was resolved partly because the outer settlement keepers began coming through the gate regularly enough that they could speak to each other directly instead of through intermediaries, who were not always accurate about what either side had said. Some things, it turned out, had been kept too long on opposite sides of a wall that did not need to be as solid as it had been. I think of the night I sat on the frozen ground beside Myra and the old wolf, in the particular silence of a winter yard after the last torch has been changed, and the warmth that was already there, that had always been there, before I had looked at it directly enough to name it. She was from Dunefin, from a settlement on no formal registry, with no standing in the inner keep and no title and no entrance to Casson's gate, that was not technically a temporary exception. She came through that gate because there were wolves dying, and the idea that the gate might stay closed against her had been, to her, simply not the point. She brought what she knew, and she gave what she had, and she asked for what she needed, and she did not perform any of it for an audience. She was the finest thing to come through Ironville's gate in 19 years. She was mine, and I was hers, and Aldrin, who had known it first, who had always known it, who had been waiting in the cold of that corner against the stone wall for a reason to stay, closed his eyes in her lap on a warm afternoon in the 4th spring, and did not wake, which was the right kind of ending for a very old and very sacred animal who had seen what he came to see and was satisfied. I had the yard keepers plant a gray stone at the corner where he had waited. It is there still. Myra brings the winter herbs to it on the coldest nights of the year, and I stand beside her, and the yard is warm with fires and full of wolves, and Ironville holds. That is the whole of it,